group of 50 of us traveled from Little Rock to Atlanta to New York City to Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And that takes a little bit of time to get there. It's an 11-hour flight from New York City to Tel Aviv, and then a bus ride of about an hour and a half on down to Jerusalem. This shot is actually taken at the top of the Mount of Olives, looking down across the Kidron Valley with the Temple Mount there in the background. Monty and Beth Cox were our hosts. Monty is the dean of the Bible College there at Harding University and has been taking trips to the Holy Land since 2011. I think he said he's taken more than 20 at this particular point. All right. There is Yossi Paz. Dr. Yossi Paz is the guide that will be going with us on this next trip in 2023. I've been with him on the 2 trips in 2019 and this summer as well. Yossi is an archaeologist. He is a flautist, plays the flute incredibly well. A mandolin player, a joke teller, a scholar, and lots of other things. But he is by far one of the best guides that will take you around the land of Israel. And he takes other tours as well. When I first started thinking about this, I wanted to talk about, there's too much, right? 8 days, we went from south to north and every other place, but I wanted us to spend a little bit of time today looking specifically at the footprints of Jesus, walking in his steps. And so I want to give you just a few minutes to kind of think through some of the places that you can walk today and know that Jesus would have been there. And one of those is his boyhood hometown of Nazareth. At that particular time, it would have been probably between the numbers, they think about 300 to 400 people. This particular picture, it's a university town and all kinds of 77,000 was the last count that they had here just a couple, 3 years ago. It is huge. This particular picture is taken from Mount Precipice. And Mount Precipice, did it go? There we go. You can see from up on top there, looking down across the valley. In Luke chapter 4, verses 16 through 30, you remember that Jesus comes back to his hometown. And he begins to speak there in the synagogue. He stands up to read. He reads Isaiah 61, 1 and 2, and talks about there's a prophet who comes home, and he has honor everywhere else, but when he comes home, he has no honor in his own hometown. And so it says that they were filled with rage and that they ended up wanting to get rid of him. So they take him up on the high hill overlooking the city and they were going to push him off. Well, this is up on top of it. And when you look over Mount Precipice, you would say that would definitely do the job. We moved from Nazareth and went on up to the Sea of Galilee. So many different things that were part of Jesus' life there on the Sea of Galilee as well. You remember that in Matthew chapter 4, verse 18, it says that Jesus was walking by the Sea of Galilee and he saw some fishermen there, 2 brothers, one named Simon, one named Andrew. And they were casting their nets into the lake, and he called them to be his disciples. There we go. One of the interesting things that we got to do is to see what is affectionately called the Jesus boat. In Luke chapter 5, verses 1 through 11, you remember that Jesus has Simon push out a little ways from the water, and he begins to speak to the crowds. But then after he finishes speaking to them, then he tells Peter, push out a little further into the deeper water, and let's throw the nets over in that great catch of fish, remember? Well, this particular boat, we have no reason to believe that Jesus was ever in it. What we do know is that it was from the era of the first century. In 1986, it was discovered on the shores after a severe drought. The water level dropped severely there in the Sea of Galilee, and there alongside the lake shore, they found some mushy pieces of wood, and they began to move some of the mud around there, and this is what they discovered, is what today is in the museum called the Jesus boat. You see a couple of different artifacts that kind of go along with that, helping us understand hundreds of archaeologists and volunteers helped to get that out. As you would imagine, the wood being saturated in water for 2,000 years basically just turned back to wood pulp. And so they had to be extremely careful. Took them 2 full weeks to get it from the mud up out of the mud, and then it took them years to be able to dry it out, and then in the form that you see it now. Again, nothing specifically to connect it with Jesus other than it would have been a boat very much like Peter and Andrew and James and John and those guys would have used to fish. 27 feet long, 7.5 feet wide at its widest. You remember the important thing about all of this, of course, was that Jesus looked at them and he said, "Follow me and I will make you fishers of men." It's not about fishing for fish anymore, is it? And again, it's just significant when you think about how much or how big a role boats played in the life and ministry of Jesus as well. This particular boat is not named for Noah, standing here beside me, or the old Noah that lived a few hundred years before this Noah. But you remember so many different things that happened there at the Sea of Galilee. Feeding of the 5,000, the demoniac, the lepers cleansed, all kinds of different things. When you think about a sea, we tend to think of something huge. Lake Gennesaret, or Tiberias, as it's called as well, because Tiberias is right there close, is only 13 miles long and about 7.5 miles wide at its widest. So it's a good-sized lake, but it's more of a lake than it is anything else. But so many things happened on this particular lake. We had the opportunity to actually sail on the Sea of Galilee, to actually be on there. We started telling stories, cut the engine and just started telling the stories we could remember. What are some of the stories you remember just out there on the water? Calming it. Peace, be still, right? Raging. Peter and the rest of them are scared to death. Don't you care that we're going to drown? And of course, we had a very beautiful day to be out on the lake, as you see here. But lots and lots of stories that talk about Jesus and that particular time. One of the neatest things that we got to do was to climb up from the Sea of Galilee. You see that in the background. And we went up on what is called the Mount of the Beatitudes. And you remember Jesus going up on the side of the mount, and he sits down and everybody is standing there and they want to hear, and they're so anxious to hear something from him. You remember when he sees the multitudes, he goes up there and he begins to speak those words of the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And Monty went through all of that with us as we got to look beyond him to the Sea of Galilee and hear those words all over again. A very special time and a very special thing to be able to hear. This was the shot of us, or not of us particularly, but where we stood and sat and then looked beyond Monty to the Sea of Galilee behind him as well. We didn't stay there very long. We didn't stay anywhere very long. In 8 days, you're going to see so much of Israel. You're going to be moving around. This is just around from where we were. It's called the City of Jesus. If you can see on the sign there, you may not be able to read that, but it says Capernaum, the town of Jesus. And in Matthew chapter 4, verse 13, it says he left Nazareth and he came and he settled in Capernaum, which is by the sea. And then in chapter 9, verse 1, it says that he returned there to his own hometown. And so Capernaum became the central hub of his ministry. And you can probably think of many of the stories of Jesus, and so often as what happens to us is we're focused in on the story, and a little detail like, oh, it's Capernaum, where these things are taking place, may escape us. This is a shot of what is called Peter's house. It is underneath a Catholic cathedral. You see the concrete right there, but you see all the stones that are underneath. In Luke chapter 4, verse 38, it says that he left the synagogue after he had been there for a while, and he went to Simon Peter's house. They believe it's very close there to the synagogue, and they believe this with fairly good evidence that this may be Peter's house as well there in Capernaum. You'll see on this, on the screen is a bigger blown up shot of what's over on that little white spot on the wall. The white rocks that you see there are the Roman era rocks, which would have been about the 4th century when they came in. They used a lot of the white stone. What you can't see very well is there in the shadow, those are all black, dark rocks, and these are the rocks that the synagogue was built on in the 1st century. This is a place where you can actually walk and look at it and say, Jesus was here. He was actually here. We walked in those areas. On top of that, the city of Capernaum by itself, you can think of these as well, all the different things that took place there. Of the 4 fishermen, Capernaum was the place where he called those fishermen to follow after him. In Matthew chapter 8, it talks about the healing of the Centurion's servant. And he says, I don't even need for you to come into my house. You just say the word, and I'm good. That took place here in Capernaum. It was also the home of Matthew. He was in the tax booth, you remember, and Jesus called him also. The healing of the nobleman's son there in John chapter 4, that happened in Capernaum. You remember the healing of the paralytic where they let him down through the roof? That's Capernaum, okay, in one of the houses of Capernaum. The healing of Jairus' daughter in Matthew chapter 9, that's Capernaum. And even the woe pronounced for unbelief on Capernaum and other cities because the miracles that had been done there, and it should have created all kinds of belief and all kinds of followers from Capernaum, but that wasn't really what took place. Very few of those people actually followed after him. We move around the Sea of Galilee to a place called Magdala, or as it's called today, Migdal. Magdala, you remember, Mary was from Magdala, Mary Magdalene, yeah. And so this was only discovered back in 2009, and so they are doing all kinds of archaeological digs around it, trying to find all kinds of things of the city. They've already found what is being covered right there was the synagogue. Very likely that Jesus would have gone through there, at least on his way to other places in his ministry as well. This was something we got to do this year we didn't get to do in 2019. We went over to the east side of the Sea of Galilee. This is the land of the Gadarenes. Do you remember the story? They've been out on the water, bad, huge storm. Jesus calms it. They come to the other side, and it says, as soon as they reach shore, you remember? Here comes this crazy guy. Yeah, the demoniac comes running towards them. Nobody could bind him. They tried to chain him. They tried to do everything they could, and they couldn't control him. And he comes running to Jesus. He asked him what his name is. He said, Legion, for we are many. And so he asked, what do we have to do with you, Jesus, Son of God? And he tells the demons to leave him, and he sends them into a group of 2,000 pigs. You remember what the pigs did? They rushed down the slope into the water. This is the area, Cursi it is called today. This is the land of the Gadarenes. This is the traditional place of the cliff that the swine would have run off. Of course, in that day, the Sea of Galilee was larger than it is right now. It's been used for irrigation for a lot of years, but this is the traditional place where that would have taken place. On top of that, we stopped in a little rest area, and this is what we found inside. It's a mosaic, supposedly of the demoniac coming to Jesus and asking, and Jesus actually healing him and sending out the demons. If you move around a little further north, you go to a place that modern day they call it Banias. In that particular day, it was called Caesarea Philippi. And do you remember the things that took place from Matthew chapter 16? Jesus asked a question. What was the question? Who do people say that I am? Yeah, okay. And then he asks even another question that's more pointed than that one, is who do you say that I am? And this is where Peter confesses that you are the Christ. Well, this is the temple of Pan, or Ban, as they said it in those days, the grotto and the remains of the temple of Augustus. Another picture of the grotto and the cave that was there. This is also what most modern day scholars, Corey mentioned this when he got to go there, they called this grotto, they called this hole in the ground the gates of hell. What did Jesus say in Matthew chapter 16? I'm going to build my kingdom and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I don't care what demons are around, his kingdom's going to stand. And so standing in this place, you can almost feel the hair on the back of your neck standing up, thinking of what Jesus said and the power with which he would have said it. From there, we went to Mount Tabor. Mount Tabor is the traditional place for Jesus' transfiguration. You remember who went with him? He took along with him Peter and James and John, and he was transfigured before them. His raiment became as white as snow. And who did they see? They were on their faces, but when they look up, who did they see there? Not just Jesus, but Moses and Elijah as well. And you're thinking to yourself, what would that conversation have sounded like when they're trying to help him prepare for his time to go to Jerusalem as he faces that also? This is you know that it didn't take very long before Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. Yes? Well, this is one of the models that's found there close in and around the place that's called, for the scrolls, where all the Dead Sea Scrolls, or many of the Dead Sea Scrolls, are housed now. But this is a model. You can see that that's not the actual Jerusalem of the first century. That would be really hard to find today. But much of his latter ministry occurred in and around Jerusalem and its surrounding area. This model that sits outside is about 1/40th, they say, of the town of Jerusalem. It's actually a quite large thing. And you see the Temple Mount there in front of it. Along beside that also is the Antonia Fortress that we'll talk about here in just a moment also. You know that the walls of Jerusalem, these are the southern steps as you go. Jesus would have gone up and down those steps several times. We stopped and had some devotional time thinking about that as well, as he would have taken the southern steps to go up to the Mount of Olives because he was there often. In fact, they said that he often went to the Mount of Olives to be by himself. And so we sat on those steps just thinking to ourselves of all the different times that Jesus would have come back and forth into Jerusalem. Again, probably the closest entrance, and many of the same stones. Do you remember what Jesus said about those stones? You see many of those falling over and down. Not one stone would be left upon another. And you're looking at it and you're going, well, there are a whole lot of stones still left. Well, that was because of so often that would be pushed over and they would be defeated, and then others would come back and build the walls again. And then they would be defeated, and then another group would come in and rebuild those as well. And it just gives us a perspective here of the walls themselves and how large they are. Again, several different times those walls were breached by different enemies. This is called the Western Wall, probably the most famous picture that you would see. The Gentiles call it the Wailing Wall, but it's really a misnomer to call it the Wailing Wall. But you see a lot of the Jewish rabbis, with their book, and they're rocking back and forth, and you're trying to figure out, and it looks, and it almost sounds like they're crying to some degree. What they're actually doing is saying their prayers, and they do that on a daily basis, come to this wall to do that over and over and over again. The reason they come here is because this is the closest you can get to the Temple Mount. And so they believe that the Shekinah glory of God still emanates from the cracks between these rocks. And so they place pieces of paper between those rocks, praying that Messiah would come. Of course, they don't believe that Messiah has already come. They don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And so they still pray that Messiah will come, not understanding when he comes next time, it won't be to deliver them. This is All right, come on. Here we go. You remember the pool of Bethesda? Out by the sheep gate, John chapter 5 tells us. And there was a man who was laying there and had been laying there for 38 years. And he was always waiting for the water to be stirred. But every time that the water was stirred, somebody else got in the water before him, remember? And Jesus asked what we would look at as some kind of crazy question. Why would he ask, do you want to get well? He wanted to find out what this man's mindset was. This is the excavated pool of Bethesda. There was another pool that was very important at that particular time. In John chapter 9, you remember the blind man? Jesus told him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and he did, and he came back seeing. That pool is still there. When you come out of the tunnel, Hezekiah's tunnel, and we walk through Hezekiah's tunnel. When you come out of the tunnel, this is the first thing you see, is the pool of Siloam as well. And looking at Jerusalem, just that thought. He was teaching daily in the temple courts. Of course, again, this is helping us kind of understand what it looks like today. We actually got to walk around up on the Temple Mount this time and to imagine all the different parts of this and how the place where Isaac would have been sacrificed. That rock is underneath that golden dome. Again, where all of the sacrifices would have taken place on the great day of atonement. So many different things. Jesus teaching up there on the temple court area. The fig tree, the parable of the fig tree, remember? The parable of the 10 virgins, the parable of the talents, and so many others that would have taken place during that time as well. But we finally had the opportunity to go from the Temple Mount. You remember where Jesus went? After that week was over, he went to the Garden of Gethsemane, and we were there on Sunday. And so on Sunday, we got to go to the Garden of Gethsemane and take the Lord's Supper in memory of Jesus there. Very special. You remember what he said? Not my will. I'd rather it be this way. If it's possible, take this cup from me, but not my will, but your will, Father. And so we had that opportunity again just to think of all the different things, his prayers, his disciples falling asleep, the resolve to do God's will, the betrayal by Judas, and the arrest. It wasn't long before he was taken to Caiaphas' house. This is the remains of Caiaphas' house outside the wall. And the most godless trial that had ever taken place took place there. There's another shot of this as well. Right above that, you see some building that's on top of this place. That particular building houses this church that's called the Church of the Gagikantu. And if you're a Spanish speaker, you can see a couple of words in Latin. All right. Gallina, right? The rooster. Cantu, sang or crowed. This is the site right above Caiaphas' house where the cock crowed 3 times to let Peter know that Jesus' words were true when he denied him. I'm never going to deny you, Lord. I don't care if everybody else does, but I won't. It wasn't long before they took Jesus to the fortress Antonio. This is where Pilate was. This is where the soldiers beat and spit on and tried every way, mocked him, did everything they could to embarrass him. You see a different picture of it from this, a little closer up, where it's right there beside the temple courts as well. It didn't take very long before they moved him down what's called today the Via Dolorosa, the way of pain. It was the way that Jesus took on the way to Calvary, carrying his own cross. This picture is called Gordon's Cavalry, or the place of the skull. If you look closely, it kind of looks a little bit like a skull. Not the traditional place, but one of the places where You see the hill there, that may have been something that was carved out particularly for that particular purpose. But this is the garden tomb. Again, not believed to be the actual tomb, but a garden tomb where people would have been placed even in the days of Jesus as well. In John chapter 20, verse 41, it says, "In the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in that garden a new tomb." You see the place. This is the place where they laid him. Do you remember Peter and John going and looking inside the entrance to be able to see not that Jesus was there, but that he was no longer there? You also you remember the Mark's phrase about it was a large stone, and the ladies trying to figure out, what are we going to do? How are we going to move this large stone? And in Luke's gospel, it tells us when the ladies finally got there, they found the stone had been rolled away. Yeah. This is a canopy that's just outside the garden tomb, and I was asked to speak there this year. It was different this year. In 2019, a lot of stuff had not happened yet. Right after 2019, my mom passed away. This year, both, I've lost my baby sister and my wife. And so standing up there this time and talking about the resurrection, so full of hope, difficult, but still so full of hope. The resurrection means something more now, and it should for each one of us as well. I've asked him to come and speak for just a couple of moments here and talk a little bit about our trip that we'll be taking in 2023 and maybe give you a few of the details. I've got some of the folders back here that I will set out on this table over here if you want to take some of those as well.
Good morning. Oh, it is certainly wonderful to see the places that Jesus walked and to be able to come face to face and experience some of the culture, some of the topography, some of the buildings and customs that influenced his life and those upon whom he influenced. We here at SIBI are continuing to strive to train whole persons to preach the whole gospel to the whole world, wholly to please Christ. And I think that a part of our doing that means adapting the things that we do when they need to be adapted in order to fit the need of the era and give our students the very best training in order to be able to serve in ministry to their best capacity so as to serve in the kingdom. And so a decision was made a couple of years ago that we would begin making trips to Israel at the end of each school year. And we do believe that in doing so, that those who have gone through the school will then be able to conceptualize and put into context a little bit better the things that they have been learning in the classroom. You know, many preachers go their whole lives without ever experiencing a trip to the land of the Holy One. But we are making it available to all of those who will be graduating from the 2-year program. And so we appreciate Kevin's leadership in helping to design this program for us, and he, of course, will be leading us on that first trip next year. And so we look forward to doing that very thing. And we're grateful for this opportunity. We are grateful for the people who are helping to make this possible for us, but we all recognize that a trip to Israel is a big financial step, because any trip these days is a big financial step, especially now that the price of fuel has gone up and therefore the price of everything has gone up. And so I want you to be able to see how some of that is working out. If you look at the slide here, you'll notice what we are asking as people come into the program. So, for example, this is based upon a person entering into the Biblical Studies program in August and going through the 2-year program and placing $100 a month into their account every month until it comes time for the trip. In doing so, the total commitment of the student would be for them to set aside $2,100. That's how many months, 21 months, in that space of time. Before we make the trip to Israel together, we will return to the student $600 of that $2,100. This is going to cover your lunches while we are in Israel. The other meals are covered, but you have to cover your lunch. And there are some other fees and things that are not covered in the trip. And so this $600 will be helpful to make sure that you will have everything that you need while you are on that trip. So the total cost, minus whatever you choose to spend on gifts, mementos, incidentals, will be $1,500. That really is a bargain in terms of being able to take a trip to Israel. The total cost to SIBI donors ends up being between $2,000 and $2,500 per student. That's how strongly we feel about this trip and how committed we are to getting you there and getting you prepared for your ministry in this way. And so we are working with our donors in order to make all of that possible. And so I do want to encourage you to take part in this, to be diligent in setting aside the funds that will be necessary to make this trip and not to be caught off guard, and to communicate with Kevin and with others to be able to make the preparations for this trip. And we are excited for this very first one, which is going to take place in July of 2023. And so may God bless us as we take this step in ministry training.